Her laugh was unfamiliar. He could hardly believe it, but the possibility of failure hovered. Pen was clever, determined, headstrong. He'd get that out of her soon enough, and stubbornly inclined to take a positive view of events. Or at least so he'd believed until today. He'd also believed that she'd leap at the chance to marry him. Clearly he'd been wrong. He wasn't used to being wrong. Confound her. He didn't like it. Her voice remained curiously flat.
"I'm sorry, Cam. There you have it, then. Won't pass muster. You'll need to do better than that."
From where she stood before the high mullioned window, she studied him, much like a schoolmistress surveyed an unpromising student. He only just resisted the urge to run a finger under his unaccountably tight neckcloth. Good God. This was Pen. She wasn't a female who put a man through hoops before she fell into harness. She'd never demand more than he could give. She'd never subject a fellow to emotional storms. She'd never lie and cheat and betray. She was the absolute opposite of his late mother, in fact. Cam was unaccustomed to feeling like a blockhead, especially with the fairer sex. By nature, he wasn't a vain man, but he'd anticipated a better reaction to his proposal. Pen's father, Lord Wilmot, had been in Alt to hear that his daughter would become a duchess. Most definitely, Pen was not in Alt. And she bloody well should be. After all, she was a mere baron's daughter, and a ramshackle baron at that, while Cam was heir to the nation's richest dukedom. The Thornes were an old family, but had always had a justified reputation for trouble. In times of political unrest, they backed the wrong side. If they managed to lay their hands on any money, they lost it, usually in some disreputable pursuit. Wine, women, and song should be the family motto, instead of the much more staid and highly inappropriate, steadfast and faithful. The previous generation had spawned a handful of eccentrics, including an uncle who had married his housekeeper, bigamously, as it had turned out. Lord Wilmot had squandered his wife's dowry on a succession of greedy strumpets. Pen's aunt ran with a dissolute crowd on the continent. Peter, Cam's friend and the current heir, was devoted to the gaming tables and disastrous investments. If Cam's mother hadn't been great friends with Lady Wilmot, the families would have had little contact. What made Pen's tepid response to Cam's suit even harder to understand was that she'd always worshipped the ground he walked on. Was he a fool to presume on childhood adoration? A horrible suspicion struck him. Was he presuming on far too much? Despite his parents' scandalous behaviour and the gossip about his legitimacy, the Ton lionized Cam as the future Duke of Sedgemoor. Had endless flattery turned him into a self-satisfied ass? If Pen thought him insufferably arrogant, no wonder his proposal hadn't bowled her over. He sighed with self-disgust and impatiently ran his hand through his hair. "I'm making a dashed mess of this, aren't I?" Pen's slender body lost its rigidity as a wry smile curved her lips. Lips, he reluctantly noticed, that were pink and full and lusciously kissable. As shock shuddered through him, he wondered why he'd never noticed before. Pen had been such a constant in his life that he hadn't taken the time to mark how she'd changed. Still unwilling to admit that Pen wasn't the girl he remembered, he looked more closely. To his dismay, the coltish adolescent hovered on the brink of becoming a true beauty. Even more dismaying, he felt the unwelcome, unmistakable prickle of desire.
"Yes, you are, but it's not totally your fault."
With a grace he hadn't seen in her before, she gestured toward the leather chairs ranged around the unlit hearth.
"Sit down, for heaven's sake, and stop looming over me."
Actually, he wasn't looming, although with his height he loomed over most people.